I was in the land of cotton, old times are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland where I was born in early on one frosty morning. Look away, look away.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Danger Boys podcast series. My name is Tappers, and today we're going to be talking about the Vicksburg campaign from December 1862 to July 1863. Now, before we get into it, I just always like to say, if you wouldn't mind liking, commenting, if it's your first time here, please hit the subscribe button. It really does help me out, so I do appreciate all the support, so thank you very much. Without any further ado, let's get into it. So, Vicksburg, right? Now, Vicksburg is a very complicated story, okay? It's not... And so what I'm going to do, right, is I'm going to use some very broad strokes, right? We're going to talk about Vicksburg very broadly, and then I'm going to try to hopefully narrow down on some things that I feel are super important, and we'll kind of leave everything else off to the side. If you're, more interested in Vicksburg, I highly recommend looking more into it. But like I said, there's a lot of really interesting details that I simply don't have the time to go into. So, like I said, we're going to look at it in kind of broad strokes, right? So how we're going to do that is first we're going to take a look at some of the commanders on the Union side, namely William Tecumseh Sherman, who is one of Grant's most trusted subordinates. He's obviously, if you know about the Civil War, he's most famous for the Sherman's March to the Sea, right? That happens later on in the Civil War. William Tecumseh Sherman is also at Vicksburg, and I said we'll get into him a little bit. We'll also talk about the Confederate commander who is in charge at Vicksburg. His name is Pemberton. We'll take a look at Pemberton's story a little bit, who he was, and whatnot. Some other names we're going to be mentioning, of course, is Ulysses S. Grant. I've already done a biography on Grant, so I don't feel like talking about him again in that much detail. And then also Joseph E. Johnston. We'll be talking about him again. If you remember Joseph E. Johnston from the first Battle of Bull Run episode I did a while ago, and he was also part of the 7 Days campaign, right? He was the commander who was in charge before Robert E. Lee, right? Johnston, he got hurt at the Battle of Fair Oaks or Seven Pines, and after he got injured, he kind of sat out the war for a while, and once he recovered from his wounds, he pops back up at Vicksburg. All right, so we'll take a look at the commanders, and then we'll take a look at the actual, plans that Grant had, some of the adversity that he had to deal with while planning out the Vicksburg campaign. And then we'll wrap up by looking at the actual campaign itself, what actually happened, and then the result of Vicksburg in the end, what it kind of meant for Grant and the Union Army as a whole. All right, so let's just get into it. So, like I said, first we're going to talk about Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton. Like I said, he is in charge at Vicksburg. He is the commanding general, if you will. So he was actually born in the North, right? He was born in Philadelphia in 1814. His parents were actually Quakers, and they were very much devout Unionists, right? Most of Pemberton's friends and family were all Unionists, and yet Pemberton ended up as a Confederate, and we'll see how that happened. So Pemberton had close ties, familial ties to President Andrew Jackson, as well as historical ties to William Penn. Like I said, his family were Quakers. They've been living in Pennsylvania for a very long time. Using his political connections, he was granted admission to West Point, where he was very close friends and roommates with George Gordon Meade. Right? Again, we know Gordon Meade from Gettysburg. Right, he is the commander who takes charge after Hooker. Hooker is replaced after the Battle of Chancellorsville. I recently did an episode on Chancellorsville. There will be a link in the description to all my episodes. If you've missed Chancellorsville, I highly recommend you check that out. So Meade replaces Hooker, and that's where we know him from. So him and Pemberton were friends before the war. Pemberton graduated middle of his class, and he was appointed to the 4th Artillery in 1837. The highest graduating members of West Point, they went into the Engineer Corps, and then in the middle went into the artillery or the cavalry, and then those who graduated, very late in the class, towards the bottom, they usually went into the infantry. So Pemberton earned a spot in the artillery. He spent most of his antebellum period fighting Native Americans in Florida. Right, there was a holdout of Native Americans living in Florida, and the United States of America was trying to clear out all of Florida to get all the Native Americans out, and of course the Trail of Tears, which is something I'm going to cover later on. I'll talk about the Trail of Tears and everything, and how badly that was. But anyway, so after fighting broke out with Mexico, right, during the Mexican-American War, Pemberton fought under Zachary Taylor. Again, this is something I talked about in previous episodes of the Civil War, where 90% of the commanders in the Civil War had experience in Mexico, and of course Pemberton is no different. So after the war, he married Martha Thompson, who was a Virginian, right, and this is why he ended up siding with the Confederacy. She encouraged him to join the Confederacy after Virginia seceded, and he did. Like I said, much to the chagrin of his family, right? His family and his friends were all Unionists, and he decided to side with his wife. And so in June of 1861, Pemberton was promoted to lieutenant general. In June of 1861, he was promoted to brigadier general within the Confederate Army. And then by October of 1862, he was again promoted to lieutenant general, and he was assigned to command in Mississippi and Louisiana, mainly focusing on strengthening the defenses around Vicksburg and the Mississippi River. Right, Vicksburg is what they call, back then they would have said is the citadel of the Mississippi. Right, it is the strongest point on the Mississippi River, and Pemberton is assigned to oversee the construction of the defenses there, and he managed to create very formidable defenses around Vicksburg. But because he was a man from the Union, because his family was from Pennsylvania, many Confederates considered him to be a traitor, right? They did not trust him. They did not trust John C. Pemberton. They thought that he might have been a Yankee spy and whatnot. He never switched sides. He was devoted to the Confederate side for the entire war. But there were many rumors and kind of talking behind his back that he secretly was, siding with the Union. And so there was a lot of trust issues around Pemberton from the men and the civilians as well. Newspapers called him a traitor as well. Okay, now on to Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. Right, he was born in 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio, to a prominent family, with his father serving as a justice on the Ohio Supreme Court. After his father's unexpected death, William was raised by a family friend, Thomas Ewing. The Ewings are a very, famous family, very well known within the United States, especially during this time. The Ewing family is very prominent. So Ewing had helped Sherman enter into West Point, where he graduated 6th of his class of 1840, and he was assigned to serve in California, and did not take part in the Mexican-American War. Right, this is a bit of a bit of a unicorn, right? Like I said, most of the commanders within the Civil War fought in the Mexican-American War, but William Tecumseh Sherman was not one of those men. He resigned his commission in 1853, and he went into business as a banker. He didn't do terrible at it, right? He wasn't great at it, but, it wasn't like Grant. If you guys remember whenever I talked about Grant, Grant absolutely failed in civilian life. Sherman, not so much, right? So he eventually took a job teaching at the Louisiana Military Academy in 1859, but resigned at the start of the Civil War, right? So William Tecumseh Sherman is one of these men who stays with the Union, right, but has South-leading ideals, right? He doesn't hate slavery as an institution. He doesn't hate the Southern people as a whole for wanting to keep their slaves, right? He thinks that it's wrong that they have left the Union, right? He believes very strongly in Union, but he does not hate slave owners. He's not an abolitionist at heart, but he said he is very much a Union-first kind of man. He was made a colonel before the Battle of First Manassas and was pretty quickly promoted to brigadier general in August of 1861. And after the Battle of First Manassas, or First Bull Run, he was sent west to join Henry Halleck in time for the Battle of Shiloh, after which he was again promoted to major general in May of 1862. If I did an episode on Shiloh, I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of it. I don't recommend you go and watch that. Watch all the other episodes, but don't watch Shiloh. But anyways, when I talked about that episode, Sherman had just gotten there, right? And he had just joined Grant. So by the time of the Vicksburg campaign, Halleck, Grant, and Sherman are all kind of getting to know each other a little bit, right? So I would say we're going to talk about Shiloh a little bit here. So after the Battle of Shiloh, right? So after Shiloh, Grant and Henry Halleck's relationship began to deteriorate, right? Going back to the Shiloh episode, Henry Halleck is the overall commander in the West, right? He has command over Grant. Grant has command over Sherman, right? That's how the chain of command is going here. Halleck felt that Grant took too long to send reports from the battlefield. This is something with Grant, right? Grant is very much a doer. He's not a big fan of sitting down and writing out long reports on what he did that day. He prefers to go out there and win a battle, right? Like, why would I sit here and type up reports for you all day when I could instead spend that time, managing my army to fight as effectively as possible and go out there and win victories? Halleck also felt that Grant took liberties with his command, kind of overstepping his bounds. So after the Battle of Shiloh, Grant took Nashville without direct orders from Halleck, right? Halleck said, "No, I should have, I'm happy that you took Nashville." That's Halleck's thing too. Is like he's not unhappy with what Grant does. He's unhappy with the way that he does it, right? So Halleck thought that Grant should have received direct orders from him to take Nashville, not just take Nashville on his own. Grant is also accused of frequent intoxication, right? This is something that follows Grant around for the rest of his life, and even now, posthumously. There's like two things that Grant's really known for, and one is unconditional surrender Grant, and two is his love of whiskey. And so Grant is during the first day at Shiloh, Grant was caught off guard, right? He was caught, and most of his men were literally caught with their pants down, as in they were just getting out of bed, they hadn't put on their pants yet, and the Confederates had completely overran Grant's position. And one of the reasons why people say that Grant was caught off guard was because he was, of course, intoxicated. So there's a lot of friction between Halleck and Grant, right? And Halleck is actually considering removing Grant from command permanently. But thanks to the actions of George McClellan, right? George B. McClellan out in the east of the war, right? He's fighting in Virginia. Lincoln is sick and tired of McClellan, right? So much, in fact, that he removes McClellan as the general-in-chief and instead decides to give that title to Henry Halleck, right? So instead of Halleck being on the field now in the West with Grant, keeping a close eye on him, Halleck is now in Washington, D.C., talking directly to the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Now, also, too, Halleck is still Grant's direct superior, right? So the way this chain of command works is that Halleck talks to Lincoln, Lincoln talks to Halleck, Halleck talks to Grant, right? Grant talks to Halleck. Grant and Lincoln do not have direct communication at this time. They will eventually. We'll see at the very end of this some of the communication that they shared. But before the fall of Vicksburg, Halleck is the only way that Grant is able to talk to Lincoln and vice versa, which is actually really good for both men, right? Because the things that upset Halleck about Grant was the direct communication as far as the day-to-day battle stuff. But with Halleck kind of out of the way, Grant can take a little bit longer to get the reports in. And Halleck can kind of sweet talk to Lincoln about Grant, right? He can downplay the accusations of intoxication. He can reassure and reaffirm Lincoln's trust in Grant, right? And we'll see a little bit over the course of this episode how Lincoln begins to kind of soften on Grant and, maybe looks at him in a slightly downwards way, right? So, like I said, despite the fact that Halleck and Grant don't always get along, Halleck does speak highly of Grant to Lincoln and is able to buy Grant a lot of time that Grant desperately needs. But yeah, so after Shiloh, Grant is not in a good position with the nation, right? His men love him. Halleck is a little frustrated, but, he can overlook that. But the papers are extremely frustrated with Grant, and like I said, the allegations of intoxication are really hurting Grant. So the fall of New Orleans, right? So Albert Sidney Johnston, right, pulled men out of New Orleans. We talked about this in the Shiloh episode, where Albert Sidney Johnston used the interior rail networks to gather up as many men as he could for Shiloh, and that included New Orleans, right? Well, of course, Albert Sidney Johnston dies at Shiloh. Grant wins a victory, And now all of the men that were pulled out of New Orleans are now fighting in the war. And so New Orleans is completely unprotected. So in late April of 1862, David Glasgow Farragut, along with Benjamin Butler, seized New Orleans while facing almost no resistance. Like I said, there was really nobody in New Orleans to stop them from doing this. And so after the fall of New Orleans, Vicksburg was the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi. So again, we talked about in the War in the West episode, which is an episode I highly recommend you go back and listen to. We talked about the fall of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, right? Those are two forts that were major in holding the Mississippi River. Those forts fall, and so now, after the fall of New Orleans, it's just Vicksburg, the citadel on the Mississippi, and this becomes a massive target for not only the Union armies, but also the Union civilians, right? When is Vicksburg going to fall? When will the Union get the complete control of the Mississippi River? When is this all going to happen, right? They're kind of anxious for Vicksburg to fall. So like I said, we'll take a look here at the river, a map of the area that we're operating in. So you can see over here we have Vicksburg, kind of above Natchez, and then down here at the bottom is New Orleans, right? So David Glasgow Farragut, he comes down, he takes New Orleans, and also too. So over this, I have a couple other maps I'm gonna pull up too. We'll take a look at it a little bit later, but basically what we want to have happen here is Grant is north, right, in Memphis, and he's coming south to Vicksburg, and he's meeting resistance along the way. But yeah, so New Orleans down here falls. So Grant's failed attempts, right? So like I said, we're talking from December of 1862 until July of 1863, right? We're talking about a very long period of time here. This is, again, one of the reasons why I'm trying to go with broad strokes, because a lot of stuff happens over those months from December to July. It's just that none of it's really good for Grant, and nothing really happens. It's a lot of stuff happens, but no progress is made. So the area around Vicksburg, right, is filled with swamps, making maneuvering very difficult, right? There's river deltas everywhere, little streams and creeks, stagnant water ponds, and flooding is a major issue as well, right? The Mississippi River is a river that is very much subject to change, right? Where in the early spring, with the spring melt and a lot of rain, the river rises. In the summertime and in the fall time, the river goes back down. It's a very temperamental river. That's the word I was looking for. It's a very temperamental river. And I said the area around there is very temperamental as well with the swamps. So at first, right, the first plan that Lincoln actually devised was a canal, right? They're going to dig a canal around Vicksburg, and this would allow the Union fleet to sail past Vicksburg's main defenses and get around them, right? So in 1862, General Thomas Williams was ordered to, dig these canals past Vicksburg. Now, despite his best effort and using recently freed slaves, the canal was abandoned by Williams due to rising water levels and malaria. And that's something else too, right? So like I said, the rising water levels was a serious problem, but also diseases. The men died both in 1862 and 1863. From malaria, smallpox, typhoid fever, name a disease, and there's a very good chance that people in the Union Army around Vicksburg, and the Confederates too, don't get me wrong, the Confederates also suffer from these same diseases. But name a disease, and there's a very good chance that they died from it. To the point where actually Grant suffered 2-to-1 casualties for every one man who died due to musket fire or some kind of battle wound. 2 men died to disease, dysentery. There was just so many different ways for men to die that were not battle related. And so in 1863, right, Grant, he tried to continue the canal with no success. Basically, Grant is sitting in Mississippi, right north of Vicksburg, and he doesn't really have anything to do with his men, right? And over in Washington, Lincoln is starting to get a little impatient, right? And if Grant doesn't start doing something, Grant is very much afraid that he's going to get replaced, right? And so Lincoln sends over a man by the name of McClernand. McClernand also has command in the Western Theater, to the point to where Grant actually writes a letter to Halleck saying, hey, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, hey, who's in command here? Am I in command, or is McClernand in command? And Halleck writes back a letter basically saying that, listen, you have complete control over all of the troops within your territory and have the right to fight the enemy wherever and whenever you choose, right? So Halleck is kind of reaffirming to Grant that, listen, just because McClernand is there and it might seem like Lincoln's trying to undermine you, don't worry, I have your back and we have your full confidence, right? And so Grant is very much concerned by this, right? He's like, okay, I got to do something. So he sends William Tecumseh Sherman down to the canal that was started by General Thomas and says, hey, get to work, start digging. Because McClernand is, trying to raise an army, right? McClernand is recently new to the theater, and he's trying to raise men. And, he goes to Grant, right? He writes a letter to Grant, says, hey, can I borrow William Tecumseh Sherman for this? And Grant says, well, sorry, man, he's digging a canal, so I can't give him up. He's too important right now. And then meanwhile, Grant's looking at the canal going, this is a terrible idea. We should not be doing this, but I have to because, I have to do something with the men. Something else as well, right? So Grant had a major problem with looting, right? Where his men who were sitting in camp for days, weeks, months with nothing better to do. And so what they would do is they would go around to towns and, homesteads, farmsteads, plantations, and just raid and pillage, right? Burn places to the ground, beat Southern women, steal their necklaces and their jewelry. And so Grant was trying to quell this by giving them something to do. And on top of this canal, right, while this canal was being dug out and is being a complete failure, Grant would also send several expeditions into the bayous around Vicksburg, right? Is there somewhere we can move through, right? Is there a road we can take? Is there is there something out there we can do to maneuver around Vicksburg? And eventually he comes to the conclusion that there really is nothing he can do. The river waters were, still way too high. And so he continues to work on this canal. And so again, by March and April of 1863, Grant was under severe pressure due to his inability to take Vicksburg, right? Again, he is kind of held in place by the fact that he doesn't know how to take Vicksburg, right? He doesn't really know how to begin to take it. And so the northern newspapers are, the headlines are, Grant hasn't moved, right? Grant's not doing anything. Grant's sitting still. He's drinking. And so Grant finally decided that, drastic measures are needed. I have to create a new plan, something that nobody has thought of before. And he does. He does exactly that. He creates an absolutely insane plan that somehow works. So a daring plan, right? So using his experience in Mexico, as well as at the taking of both Fort Henry and Fort Donaldson, Grant, he created a plan, right? So the first step of the plan was to get the Union gunboats and troop transport vessels past Vicksburg, right? And they called this running the gauntlet. He would do this in the dead of night. Grant would then move his army south of Vicksburg by traveling through Louisiana. He would then abandon supply depots in favor of foraging for supplies, because that's one of the major issues too, is how is he able to get supplies to his army while moving through the Confederate country, right? They control the Union controls the north of the Mississippi River, and they can control New Orleans, but the middle part of the river that they're trying to attack is all Confederate areas. And so Grant also, too, that was something else that was going on during this time, during the winter and early spring of 1863. He was being constantly harassed by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who I talked about in my history of the KKK episode, Nathan Bedford Forrest. His cavalry is absolutely destroying Grant's supply lines. And also cutting telegraph networks. Grant goes out of communication with Halleck for a very long time while he begins this campaign, right? Another thing, too, like I said, we talked about Joseph E. Johnston, right? Johnston is operating in Grant's area, right? He's out there. So you have Pemberton, who is sitting inside of Vicksburg, and you have Joseph E. Johnston, who is hanging out just outside of Vicksburg. I think it's like 100 miles away, which, is a long distance right now, but, during the Civil War, 100 miles is not that far for a, well-commanded marching army. And like I said, that was in Jackson, Mississippi, where Joseph E. Johnston is stationed. So Grant has to figure out a way to get Joseph E. Johnston out of the way. And then after the army and the boats were reunited south of, Vicksburg, Grant would cross over the Mississippi and destroy vital rail lines supplying Vicksburg. He would move north to take the city, right? So Grant, he devises this crazy plan in his head, and he calls his subordinates in for a meeting, and he tells them his plan, right? And Sherman says, it would never work. This is insane. That you're crazy for doing this. But Grant did not believe in a council of war, right? Grant is the commanding general. He is the head of the army. He is the decision maker. I am telling you this is what we're going to do. You can disagree with it all you want, but this is what I'm telling you to do, and you will not give me counsel on how to do this. Right? I am saying this is how we're going to do it, and this is how it's going to be done. And of course, like I said, so Sherman, he disagreed with the plan wholeheartedly. He said this is a terrible idea. But he did say that it did not matter what he thought, that he would execute Grant's plan to the absolute best of his ability, and his what's the word I'm looking for? His respect and loyalty. His loyalty to Grant would never waver, right? Sherman wrote a series of letters home to his family, basically saying that Grant's out of his mind. He's a lunatic for this. But again, Sherman would never do that in front of Grant, right? He would never question him directly to his face, outside of this very private meeting that him and a very select few people. In front of the army, he would follow Grant into the underworld and back. There's nothing that Sherman would not do for Grant, even if he personally disagreed. That would not stop him from executing the plan. So that's basically the plan, right? So Grant is going to move south. Use troop transports to get across the Mississippi River from Louisiana to Mississippi. And then he would, confront Joseph E. Johnston and then, destroy all networks that Vicksburg has out, into the rest of the Confederacy, and then sit on Vicksburg and starve it out. So the execution of the plan, right? So David Dixon Porter commanded the boats Grant needed. This is something else too, right? So we're going to talk about this at the end, just like what this meant as far as, campaigns, and not just, Civil War history, but, human history, right? Like this is one of the great campaigns in human history. If you know anything about like Hannibal in ancient Greece, or Rome, ancient Rome, I'm sorry, not Rome, Greece. Hannibal invades Italy, right? And there's this, it's a insane campaign that, and this is up there with that, right? The Vicksburg campaign is up there with some of the greatest campaigns in human history. And they said, well, we'll talk more about that at the end. But one of the reasons why it is such an impressive feat is that the Navy and the Army do not work together, right? You have Army operations and you have naval operations. You don't have joint ventures because David Dixon Porter cannot be ordered by Grant. And neither can neither can Porter order Grant, right? So Grant can't take orders from Porter. Porter can't take orders from Grant. They have to work together, without having the pressure of like, oh yeah, you're my boss, I have to listen to you, right? No, they have to work together. And so Porter met with Grant and Sherman for the first time shortly before this campaign went underway. And Porter basically agreed that, listen, Grant, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to put all my faith into you, and I'll do what you want me to do. And this ended up being one of the greatest symbiotic relationships of the entire war. So on April 16th, right, Porter, he began to sail his ships past Vicksburg. Now, very keenly, one of the major keys of this, right, the reason why it was April 16th is that there was a party happening in Vicksburg, right? Some of the commanders, Pemberton, invited a whole host of people to his command within Vicksburg, and they had a massive party, right? And very importantly, the commanders of the artillery that was watching over Vicksburg, right, that was protecting the river, they were all at this party as well. So you only had a handful of men who were sitting on the banks of Vicksburg, watching basically. And so on April 16th, like I said, Porter, he began to sail his ships past Vicksburg. They were very quickly spotted by these few men that were sitting out there waiting, and gunfire erupted all around. Massive bonfires were lit along the banks of the river, which illuminated the fleet. Grant brought his family with him. He was never very far away from his family during the war. I talked about it in the War in the West episode when I did Grant's biography. Grant is very much a family man. He relies very heavily on his family. And so one of his sons actually wrote in his memoirs about, traveling down the Mississippi in this fleet, that it looked like it was daylight. It was so bright. The fires were so bright and so intense that it looked like daylight. But despite this, right, despite the Confederates' best efforts, only one gunboat was disabled, and several troop transports were also damaged beyond repair, right? But for the most part, the entire fleet gets by pretty much unmolested. I think something like 12 sailors were injured during this, and most of that was because of musket fire, not cannonballs. Most of the cannonballs that were fired from the Confederates bounced off of the Union gunboats because their defenses were just so strong. The iron plating that was on the outside of these ships, along with I think it was 40-inch hulls that they had, 40 inches of wood behind the iron, and most of the cannonballs just bounced right off. So Grant, he hung around, right? He supervised the vessels going past Vicksburg. Grant rejoined his men and began marching south. Now again, Grant was dealing with, pillaging, right, from his men. His men were very much of the mindset of, hey, that's burned stuff. It's, and Lincoln had encouraged part of it, right? So with the Emancipation Proclamation coming out in 1862, being released after, the loss at Fredericksburg, slaves, right, were to be taken by the Union Army as a war measure, right? That's something that's very important too with the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in Confederate states that were not currently occupied by Union soldiers. And so what Lincoln wanted to have happen was these large plantations that had a lot of slaves were to be burned to the ground. All of the cotton or whatever other crops they were growing were to be destroyed or used by the army. But the small homesteads, right, where you had almost no slaves, for the most part, most of these poor families in the South did not own slaves. They were to be left alone, right? The small homesteads with one or two people living in it, or a small family, weren't supposed to be molested. And so Grant, trying to prevent that, right, to encourage his men to not hurt these small families, moved the men very, very quickly, right? And so his army covered 200 miles in 18 days, an absolutely remarkable feat. Again, this was something else I talked about, right? So Joseph E. Johnston's about 100 miles away from Vicksburg. Well, Grant can march 200 miles in 18 days. This is, again, at this point in the war, especially with going back to McClellan in the East, this is something that nobody else can do, right? 200 miles in 18 days is absolutely insane. Most of the men did not have tents, so they would just kind of sleep out in the open, and then, break a day, they're off marching again. So again, the large plantations were raided, and crops were burned to the ground. Mules were, stolen. Horses were stolen. Cows and pigs were slaughtered, and the meat was used. And again, too, right? So Grant is not worried about his supply basin, right? He's not worried about trying to keep a supply chain open to him. He is actively wanting the men to go into these orchards, right? A lot of these southern plantations had large, apple and tree, peach and farms on them, and he was encouraging them to basically feed themselves, right? But also something else too, with the Emancipation Proclamation, is that Lincoln wanted the recently freed slaves to become fighting men, right? And there was a lot of men who were against this, right? Especially, like we said, we already talked about William Tecumseh Sherman being a bit of a Southern sympathizer, in that he didn't necessarily believe that the slave trade was that bad, or that slavery, didn't necessarily need to be eliminated from the Union. With the Emancipation Proclamation being worded the way that it was as a war measure, this began to change the thinking of some of the men, right? Where the reason why the South was fighting for as long as it was because of the slaves, right? The slaves were behind the scenes, helping to feed the army of, the Confederates, helping bringing in crops, which brought in money to the Confederacy so the Confederacy could buy guns and other things of that nature. And so these Northern men who didn't initially see the ending of slavery as the ultimate goal of the Civil War quickly realized that, hey, the reason why the South's fighting so well is because of the slaves. If we were able to free them, then that resource is now away from the Confederacy. There are not so many slaves helping out in the Confederacy, and we're going to end the war faster. And so newly freed middle-aged male slaves were given a rifle and taught, how to march and how to fight effectively. And so at first, Grant would use most of these free slaves in rear, actions, basically, guarding the end of the line, right? Keeping them out of the way, basically. Because, and also too, they were unproven, right? So that's another thing too with these black regiments that begin to get raised, is that until they get into a fight, most of these white men don't know how the slaves are going to fight, right? Or, are they capable of it? Are they intelligent enough, right? These are all questions that they have, which will be answered, and it proves out that, African Americans are very much capable of fighting and whatnot. But the mindset has to change, and that slowly starts to evolve. And that begins here at Vicksburg, where these men who, like I said, didn't initially want to get into the war to free slaves, realize that it's the best way to end the war as quickly as possible. So, so Grant is moving south, right? He's moving south, and he meets up with the gunboats and the transport ships, and he begins ferrying his men across the river. There is the capital of Mississippi is Jackson, Mississippi. And so Grant orders Sherman and McPherson, who is another corps commander of his, right? Sherman's one of the corps commanders, McPherson is another, to seize Jackson, Mississippi, right? He orders these two corps to take Jackson. Joseph E. Johnston, he commanded a very small force in Jackson, and hearing that the Union was on its way, he immediately orders the city to be evacuated, right? And so on the afternoon of May 13th, most of Jackson, Mississippi had been evacuated, and Johnston had retreated completely. Grant, who was traveling with Sherman, right? He was traveling with Sherman's corps. He entered Jackson and raised the stars and stripes above the Mississippi capital. This hurt morale in the South a lot, right? The fall of Jackson, because now everyone's eyes are on Vicksburg, and basically how long is it going to take for Vicksburg to fall is kind of the question on the Confederates' minds. So while they were in Jackson, right, Grant oversaw the burning of some factories, and they also burned rail networks that led to Vicksburg, right? Again, Grant wants to cut off all the arteries of Vicksburg so it is completely alone and stranded. Sherman, who again, when we talk about Sherman with the Sherman's March to the Sea, which we'll talk about later, one of the most famous things about that was Sherman's neckties, right? This is how they would destroy the railroads, right? They would take fire, right? They would heat up the iron that the railroads were made of, right? The steel girders. They would heat them up really, really hot, and then they would take them and wrap them around trees, twisting them up and knotting them up, and so they would be completely unusable, right? And these became known as Sherman's neckties, and this is kind of the progenitor to what Sherman would do later on in the war. And so after after Jackson, Mississippi had been, taken off the map, basically, it is no longer contributing to the survival of Vicksburg. Grant turns around and he heads back to Vicksburg. Also, too, around this time, he begins to communicate with Halleck again, right? Lines of communication are able to open up between Halleck and Grant. And so Grant starts to keep him informed on as far as, what's going on with Vicksburg. So Champion Hill and the Big Black River, right? So Pemberton, right? So like I said, Joseph E. Johnston and Pemberton are in this kind of together, but they're not united. And that's one of the key things too, is that, Pemberton and Johnston just cannot work together. So Pemberton, he had sent a small force to a place called Champion Hill in an attempt to stop Grant. And this is on May 16th, right? Grant basically just steadily pushes forward up Champion Hill, moving closer and closer to the rebel defenses. And after some very fierce fighting, the Confederates decide to fall back and start to retreat to Vicksburg. Now, Grant used Champion Hill as a headquarters for a very short period of time. It eventually became a hospital for both Confederate and Union, casualties. And then on May 17th, right, so the day after, the Union Army is pursuing the retreating Confederates to a bridge over the Big Black River. The Confederates were holding a defensive work on the other side of the river, but soon became overwhelmed. And then by the end of the day on May 17th, the remaining Confederates either fled to Vicksburg or surrendered to Grant. Grant had lost very few men in these engagements, losing far more men to diseases than musket fire. Like I said, it's almost 2-1, right? Where Grant loses 2 men to disease for every one that is lost to musket fire. And again, this is another reason why the Vicksburg campaign is held up in such a high esteem, is because he did not take very many losses, right? And we go back earlier in the Civil War to Fredericksburg, right? And Burnside and those terrible attacks, losing tens of thousands of men. We look at Chancellorsville, again, massive loss of human lives. Shiloh as well, massive loss of human life. And this really shows Grant at how Grant loved to operate, right? He loved to maneuver. He loved to move skillfully and quickly, overwhelming his opponents and taking very little casualties. This is how if Grant could have fought the whole war this way, this is how he would have done it. So absolutely remarkable. He wins 5 battles in 5 days and loses very, very, very few men. So here's a map, right, taking a look at everything we just talked about and a few things we didn't necessarily talk about. So we'll look here first at Port Gibson, right? So this is after Grant moves south. So you see on the left side here, all the way to the left, up north of New Carthage, Grant moves his army down the Mississippi River, through Louisiana, and meets up with the gunboats down here at Grand Gulf, right? You can see these are the gunboats coming south. And so he meets up with his gunboats down here. They move across and they win a battle at Port Gibson. I didn't talk about the Port Gibson battle again. We're talking broad strokes here, very broad strokes. And now Grant, instead of coming straight north to Vicksburg, he cuts over to Raymond and then Jackson. Again, we didn't talk about Raymond, but here's Jackson, Mississippi. And you can see Johnston, right, gets pushed out north, out of Jackson, Mississippi. He ends up going north into Livingston. Grant, like I said, sacks Jackson, goes back across to Champion Hill, which is over here, and then the Big Black River bridge over here, and you can see Pemberton falling back into Vicksburg. And then Grant also sends a force north over the Big Black River and then south down the Yazoo River, and where he would eventually engulf Vicksburg entirely. But yeah, so this is the, like I said, an overview of what we've been talking about, right? And so we can kind of visualize where everything is and how it's happening. So the siege of Vicksburg itself, right? So starting on May 18th, Grant began to surround Vicksburg. While hoping to avoid a long siege, Grant ordered attacks against the Vicksburg fortifications, right? Grant says, hey, listen, we just won 5 battles in a row. The Confederate army is completely whipped. Johnston's fleeing in retreat. Pemberton's fleeing. This is going to be easy, boys. Just go over the hills, go over the fortifications, and let's take this city. And this was a terrible idea, right? This is Grant's worst decision almost of the entire war, to try and take the fortifications these first couple days at Vicksburg. Right, so Pemberton very wisely took the troops that had retreated from, Champions Hill and the Big Black River and had them away from the front line, right? He had fresh troops on the front line. And so Grant, far from, facing a bunch of whipped men, he's facing brand new, fresh fighting men. And so after these terrible, terrible attacks had failed, Grant lost more men in these, secessions of assaults that he had tried to commit. He lost more men, right, in these assaults than he did in the previous 6 months of campaigning, right? So over the last 6 months, Grant did not pile up a very large body list. Even with the disease and everything else that he was suffering from, there were a lot of casualties, but not nearly as much as these few assaults at Vicksburg. So after realizing that Vicksburg would not fall easily, Grant ordered a constant bombardment of the town, right? He sets up cannons. He has Porter, David Dixon Porter, on the Mississippi River with his gunboats and mortar boats. He sets them up and says, hey, listen, just bombard the hell out of the town, right? And so Porter, using his gunboats mounted with mortars to great effect, he bombarded every inch of Vicksburg, right? Homes were destroyed. Families who were sitting down to their dinner might have a projectile fall through their roof, through their dining room table, and down into the basement, right? And that happened on more than one occasion. There were hospitals in Vicksburg would put yellow flags on top of their, roofs and like hang them up. So that way people would know, so the Union would know that there were hospitals there. And while Porter and Grant did not specifically aim for the hospitals, a lot of times they looked at those yellow flags and said, yeah, you know what? I think they're faking it. I don't think that's really a hospital. I think they're trying to, dilute us, and try to trick us into thinking that every building in Vicksburg is a hospital. That can't be the case. And so they ended up blowing up a couple hospitals, injuring many civilians inside. Many civilians lost arms and legs. And we're talking about, inside the hospital, people are already in there for injuries or, illness. And now they're getting even more injured. There was a congregation at one point walking out of church. There was a church in Vicksburg. There's several churches. But there was a congregation walking out of the church, and a shell blew up right outside the church. There were no casualties. There were no deaths, but a couple people did have to get amputations after that. And so the civilian population living in Vicksburg began to dig caves into the hills behind the town to shelter from the artillery, right? They couldn't stay in their homes anymore because it was too dangerous. And so they moved into caves. But these caves were often overcrowded and unsanitary. You would often find up to 20 individuals living in one cave where they would share, right? Multiple families would be sharing these caves. The women and children were mostly living in the cages because most of the men were, up on the battlements trying to defend Vicksburg. So these women and children, they would bring in furniture into the caves. They would bring, rugs in. They would bring in their beds and everything. But one of the biggest problems, right, like I said, was, unsanitary conditions where, you have really bad air, terrible ventilation inside of these caves. And so not a lot of oxygen's getting in, and the smell is absolutely horrendous. But also you would have snakes and other vermin that would find their way into the caves. Copperheads and rattlesnakes would often bite people, and then also rats and, the diseases that come with rats were moving into the caves. Something else too, right? So not just the bombardments, right? Not just the mortar fire and the cannons, but Union sharpshooters worked in 2-hour shifts watching the Confederate defenses. Basically, these men would lie there for 2 hours waiting for any sign of movement, anything at all. And these men would get bored in sitting there and waiting. And so any sign of movement at all, it wasn't just one man firing. It could be up to 100 guns. And so oftentimes, Confederate men would stick their head up over the barricades and over the defenses, and they would have their head would be absolutely destroyed by these Union sharpshooters. Also, too, the Confederates had a limited supply of ammo, right? They were completely cut off. They had absolutely no contact with the outside world. And several times during this, Pemberton tried to get word to Johnston, and Johnston tried to get word to Pemberton to try to coordinate some kind of attack. Maybe Pemberton launches an attack from Vicksburg and Johnston hits him from behind or something, but they cannot get messages to each other because Grant is so good at intercepting those. And so the Union has basically an unlimited supply, right? Because by this point, Grant had set up full fortifications. He has supply lines going all the way back to Washington, D.C., so he has unlimited ammunition. And so there was actually a story of a mule that had stumbled out of Vicksburg. It was starving, and it was a starved mule. But the Union, saw this mule and decided to take a shot at it. And so it was like 150 guns open up fire on this mule and absolutely decimate it. But it's because, they've been sitting there for so long, they get kind of bored. And yeah, so you definitely did not want to poke your head up. That was something that the Confederates learned very quickly, was do not stick your head up above the defenses, because you will die. Another thing too, right? So the siege of Vicksburg, we're talking like 2 months, right? From May until July 3rd, July 4th. It's kind of a little hazy. They kind of surrender on July 3rd, but also the official surrender is July 4th. But anyways, Grant gets bored, right? He spends every day, he walks along the entrenchments that his men have built, talking to the men and whatnot, but he gets bored. And so Grant goes on a couple of benders where he drinks himself into an absolute stupor. And so that's something that is commented on by his subordinates. But his subordinates are very loyal to Grant, right? He has been leading them this far. He's been doing a very good job of leading them. And so his men, basically don't tattletale on him. They help him by trying to keep everything under wraps, that he's been drinking as much as he has. So the end of Vicksburg, right? So by the middle of June 1863, Grant's forces numbered over 60,000. Despite his best efforts, Joseph E. Johnston was unable to raise a sufficient force to challenge Grant. So before the battle, before Grant showed up at Vicksburg, right? Pemberton and Johnston outnumbered Grant, right? Together they had a force of like 50,000, and Grant had a force of about 30,000, right? And so if Johnston and Pemberton had been able to unite each other, they would outnumber Grant almost 2-1. But alone, Johnston only had 20,000, and Pemberton only had like 25,000. And so Johnston is a bit of a coward. Okay, he's the guy that retreated from McClellan, right? And if Johnston is not able to handle McClellan of all people, he's definitely not going to be able to handle Grant. And so Johnston is waiting to have an overwhelming numbers advantage, right? If Grant has 30,000, then Johnston wants 90,000, right, before he makes any kind of attack. And so Johnston is calling out to Vicksburg, or to Richmond, right? He's calling out to the Confederate leaders, saying that, hey, listen, I need troops. And so Johnston called on Longstreet, right, and General Lee's army for reinforcements, right? Now, Robert E. Lee and Confederate President Jefferson Davis thought Longstreet would be better served in what would become Lee's Gettysburg campaign, right? So with Vicksburg under siege, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee basically write off Vicksburg. They say, hey, listen, Vicksburg is going to fall to Grant no matter what we do. Instead of, sending men to Johnston, and also to Jefferson Davis and Johnston do not like each other. Jefferson Davis loathes Johnston, and Johnston loathes Jefferson Davis. Johnston is also very jealous of Robert E. Lee. So that's something else too with Johnston that kind of counts against him, is that he did not get along with his president, and he did not like Robert E. Lee. And so Lee says, hey, listen, instead of throwing men into Vicksburg, which is already lost, how about I go north into the Union? I'm going to march my army north, and we're going to go and we're going to, take the fight to the Union. That's going to be great for us, right? And Jefferson Davis goes, heck yeah, Robert E. Lee, you're my man. I'm your man. Go north, and God bless you. And of course, what we know happens at Gettysburg is that Lee suffers his greatest defeat of the Civil War. His army is completely battered, and Longstreet, who was involved with the Pickett's charge and whatnot, basically from day one of Gettysburg, Longstreet is telling Lee, hey, this is really dumb, man. We shouldn't be doing this. I did a 2-part series on Gettysburg. There's a link in the description to my playlist. Highly recommend you listen to the Gettysburg series. It's one of my favorites. So Longstreet, right? Longstreet does not come to Johnston's aid. And so with Johnston unable to get reinforcements and unable to communicate with Pemberton in any meaningful way, the soldier and civilian populations in Vicksburg, they begin to starve again because there is no way to get supplies to Vicksburg. They ate horses, they ate the dogs, they ate the cats, and they ate the rats. Basically, anything that moved was put into stews and eaten. A note began to be passed around Confederate soldiers saying either feed us or surrender us, right? And this is, challenging Pemberton directly, right? They're telling Pemberton, hey, you need to feed us or you need to give up because this is bad, man. This is really bad. And so without hope, Pemberton, he reached out to Grant and asked him, what are your surrender conditions, right? What conditions will you give me? Initially, Grant would offer his famous unconditional surrender. It's the same thing he gave to Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, right? But was soon convinced by his subordinates that the Army could not handle 30,000 POWs. Again, Pemberton holds a very significant force within Vicksburg, 30,000 men. But deep into enemy country, with barely enough supplies to feed himself, right? Grant did have enough supplies for his own army, but not an extra 30,000, right? He could not feed the Confederate people. Grant decided that he would parole the Confederate, the Confederate surrenderies, right? The enemy force, Pemberton's men, were going to be paroled. And what that means is that all the men could keep their personal property except for slaves, right? So their army-issued musket would have to be returned to Grant, right? Grant gets their musket, but all of their personal property, watches, whatever, they were able to keep, except for, of course, the slaves who were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. And so on top of that, they also had to sit out the war until equal trades could be made. So the parole system is very complicated. I might get into it later. I'm probably not. But the roundabout way of explaining the parole system is that whenever the Union Army would, capture enemy combatants, and the Southern Army would capture enemy combatants, exchanges would be made of equal value, right? So like I have 4 privates, you have 4 privates, let's exchange those 4 privates, right? You have a general, I have 2 corporals, right? I'll trade you 2 corporals for a general, right? That kind of deal. It's a very complicated process, but basically it meant that these men had to go home and sit and wait until a Union man was released from the Confederate, POW camps. And then they could rejoin the war, right? Okay, these guys got released, so I can go back to the war. But a lot of these men, right, would not rejoin the army. They would go back to their homes with their wives and their children, and they would not return to the war. Many of them did come back, but a lot of them didn't. And then on July 4th, right, so the same day that Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, Vicksburg was officially back in Union's hands, right? This was, again, brought on by Pemberton, right? Pemberton says that if we can hold out until July 4th, we will get better terms than if we surrender earlier because of what it'll mean to the Union. And again, the Southern people called him a traitor. They said, wow, how could you surrender Vicksburg on July 4th, the day of the Declaration of Independence? How could you do this? And so they said Pemberton was very much called into question as a leader. But so the aftermath, right? So what happened after? Like I said, Grant's Vicksburg campaign is considered one of the greatest campaigns in human history. The quickness that he moved his men, the ability that he had to cut himself off from his supply lines and forage for food off of the land, his combination of using the riverboats and the way he defeated Johnston, all of it comes together to make one of the greatest campaigns in human history that is still studied at West Point today, is still used by modern generals, even up until the like Black Hawk Down, right, and the wars in the Middle East in the late 90s. These tactics that Grant used are still continue to be used by generals today all over the world. Like I said, I can't understate just how impressive this is. Sherman told Grant after they arrived at Vicksburg to begin the siege that Grant had completed a triumph, even if Vicksburg wouldn't be taken. So if you remember back earlier in this episode, Sherman tells Grant, you're out of your mind, man. This is never going to work. This is a terrible plan. You are crazy, dude. Well, now Sherman is saying that, listen, this was incredible. I never believed in this plan with an ounce of my body, but here we are. We've done it. And they said right before they started to siege Vicksburg, Sherman's saying that, Grant, this was incredible, man. Just getting here was brilliant. I don't even know what else to say. You're incredible, man. And then Lincoln also wrote a letter to Grant after the fall of Vicksburg. So if we remember, Grant cuts off communication with Halleck for a short period, and then by the time he's at the Big Black River and whatnot, he's back in communication with Lincoln. And this is the letter that Lincoln wrote to Grant. I wanted to put the whole thing in here because I think it's absolutely one of my favorite things that Lincoln ever wrote. But so here it is. Major General Grant, my dear General, I do not remember that you and I ever met personally. Just a little side note, Grant and Lincoln had not corresponded before this. Again, Grant would talk to Halleck, Halleck would talk to Lincoln. There was no direct communication. So I do not remember that you and I ever met personally. I write this now as grateful acknowledgement for the almost inestimable service that you have done to the country. I wish to say a word further. When you first reached the vicinity of Vicksburg, I thought you should do what you finally did. March your troops across the neck, run the batteries with transports, and thus go below. And I never had any faith, except a general hope that you knew better than I, that the Yazoo Pass expedition and the like could succeed. When you got below and took Port Gibson, Grand Gulf, and the vicinity, I thought you should go down the river and join General Banks, and when you turned northward of the Big Black, I feared it was a mistake. I now wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. Yours truly, A. Lincoln. Right? So, sorry for butchering that, but basically what Lincoln is saying is that, listen, I lost faith in you. I did. I did not believe in your plan at all, but here we are. You have succeeded where I did not think that you could succeed. You were right and I was wrong. And Lincoln would go on in other letters to Grant. Now that this kind of correspondence began between the two, the floodgates would kind of open and they would write letters back and forth to each other throughout the war. But Grant, Lincoln would go on to say, basically that, I am Grant's and Grant is mine, right? Like, Grant's going to be a very pivotal role, in the future of the, Union, war effort. And he'll go on to actually take Halleck's position as general-in-chief. But yeah, so that's it. All right, that's all I have. This went, oh my gosh, 1 hour and 2 minutes. Jesus. I was really hoping to be done with this a lot sooner. This is the problem with Vicksburg, right? Whenever I started working on Vicksburg a long time ago. I think my last episode that I did was like 4 or 5 months ago. It's like back in December. Might even been longer. Maybe April, May. I don't know. Anyways, I've been working on this for such a long time. And, I said the problem with it is that there's just so much information. Gettysburg happens in like 4 days. The Battle of Bull Run, first Bull Run was like a day. Hell, Chancellorsville was like, 5 days, I think, Chancellorsville, the Battle of Chancellorsville was. I did the War in the West episode, but we talked about Fort Henry falling and Fort Donelson falling, but Grant got both of those pretty quickly. It wasn't a very long thing. But Vicksburg, man, just so much stuff happened, and there's so much I left out. There really is. There's a lot of stuff I left out. But again, I don't think it's that important. I think it is if you want to get the overall picture of Vicksburg. Not just the overall picture, but you want to really dive into it, right? To really see all of the special moments. I highly recommend reading Grant's biography. He gets some things wrong in his biography, which of course, you're going to change some things around to, paint yourself in a better light and whatnot. I don't blame the man for that, but I highly recommend you guys look further into Vicksburg because, like I said, there's so many interesting stories in there. But yeah, that's what I got for this. I think I'm going to take a break from the Civil War at this point. Next thing we're going to do in the Civil War, though, is going to be like the Battle of the Crater and the Overland Campaign, Lincoln or Grant versus Lee. That's really all we have left to talk about, honestly. There's some smaller battles that I haven't talked about, but I probably won't. I just don't have an interest to do it. So instead, what I'm going to do next is probably go back to the World War II series. We're either going to continue the Russian Revolution into the Russian Civil War, or do the burning of the Reichstag and Hitler's ultimate rise to power. To get, as I said, I want to get all of that caught up together, basically. I'm going to talk about American nationalism, too, like during World War I. then the bombing of Pearl Harbor too. But like I said, I want to try to do that kind of sequentially, and so I want to get Russia and Germany caught up to where I want to start talking about America. But yeah, that's really all I got. So I'm gonna take a break from the Civil War series for a little bit, so divert over to the World War II series, and then maybe start a new one. I know I talked a long time ago about the Napoleon series, and I ran into a similar problem that I ran into with Vicksburg. Was there's just so much stuff about Napoleon that there's just so much stuff. But yeah, man. Hey, well, that's a podcast episode. This is a recording of Dixie, by the way. Like from 1916, I think. But yeah, so I say that's all I got, guys. Yeah, as always, hey, namaste.
Hooray, hooray,